Hi and welcome to the channel. Today I want to talk to you about this patch that is inspired by the British electronic music composer and producer Jon Hopkins. He's specifically inspired by his album Immunity from 2013 and the song Breathe This Air. I must confess that I got to know the work of Jon Hopkins quite recently, first by his album Singularity, immediately noticing something special about the quality of his production, not only in terms of electronic music genre, but a lot in terms of sound design, which is the main theme of this channel. And I mean, far from being a perfect reproduction of Jon Hopkins' masterclass sound design, this is me trying to figure it out, the main elements that constitute some of Jon Hopkins' classic sound. And specifically this lead sound, it's a recurrent element that you can hear both in Immunity and Singularity album. And after designing this patch, I actually went on doing the research about the song Breathe This Air, and I have learned that it was specifically in the Immunity album that Jon Hopkins added to his arsenal a Korg MS-20. Most likely this was the synth where he developed this sound, but what I wanted to bring to you today is the lessons learned from trying to reproduce that sound. And I think I learned a few tips and tricks here that I wanted to share with you, and maybe you will also learn with me. It's been a while since I did my last Patch It video, so if you're not familiar with the channel, what I'll try to do is to show you how I made this sound in Hydrasynth, and I will deep dive in all my signal chain here so that you can reproduce this patch in your Hydra or try to mimic this sound design in a compatible system. So without further ado, let's patch it. When I normally do a tutorial in the channel around patching in Hydra, I start from the voice menu and my sound sources. But today I wanted to try something different with you by telling you a little bit of my sound design process. When I started with this patch, I had a hint of what kind of sound waves I was wanting to use, but the only thing I knew for sure was that this was a sound that has a very quick attack, almost like a percussive sound. So I actually have started my sound design from my amplifier envelope here, because this was what I could hear directly from this lead sound. So let's start from my amplifier envelope here, and let me show you how this looks like. If we look here on the screen, you will see that what I have, it's a very short attack and decay, and my sustain level is also not that high. I have actually elongated a little bit my release phase here to get this more ambient sound that you get from Jon Hopkins sound design. So if we look here on the first page of my envelope 2, what I have is an attack of 19 milliseconds, a decay of 72 milliseconds, sustain set to 59, a release time of 352 milliseconds, and this is not quantized nor synchronized with a BPM. I haven't messed up too much with my curves here, and if I now look into my amplifier parameters there, what we'll see is that I'm not connecting my amplifier to neither LFO or key velocity, and my amplifier level is at 64. So the second thing I've looked into in my sound design process here, once my amplifier envelope was configured, was trying to find the sound sources that matches Jon Hopkins' lead sound. So if we have a look here in my mixer, you will notice that this sound is composed by 3 sound sources, oscillator 1, 2, and 3, that will have a different influence into the overall sound. So let's start here from oscillator 3, that is the most predominant sound in my mix here. If we look at oscillator 3, that's a very peculiar waveform that originates from the reach wavetable bank in Hydrasynth. But the name of this wave gives us a clue of what you can use into your system in case you're not reproducing this in your Hydra. Because pulse wave 1 is in essence a type of square wave, and as a base of my sound, or the predominant sound source that composes this lead sound, you can see that this is tuned to -24, which will give me 2 octaves below the notes I play in the keyboard, giving me the bass sound that hold up the lead. Let me mute oscillator 3 here, or let me solo oscillator 3 here, so that you can hear how it sounds in isolation. So you can hear that oscillator 3 already contains that pluck sound coming from the amplifier envelope, but it also gives us a thick bass sound with the harmonics of a square wave. Let me turn back the 3 oscillators. And now if we look to the second predominant sound here, oscillator 1, you will look at the special waveform from Hydrasynth here, and that one is called flux. More important than the waveform, I think the main lesson for me here was the interval that Jon Hopkins was using between the bass note and the high octave one. Because if you hear again this lead sound, you see that there is an implicit harmony to it, and this is given by this interval where oscillator 1 here is tuned actually 7 semitones above the played note, what gives us this 7th interval. And what you see here in the tuning for my sense that is set to a value of -5, this is contributing to that out of tune phasing that you normally get from analog synthesizer. Last but not least, if I return here to the mixer to look at our sound sources, we have oscillator 2 set to a volume of 57, and this one is also a specific waveform that you find in Hydrasynth. But if we look at oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 waveforms, they both contain an ingredient of a sine wave, which will give us that clear fundamental to the sound. But here we also see elements of a squarish kind of wave that will give me back some of the harmonics that we lose in the sine wave. So oscillator 2 here is also set to a single waveform with a sync love 2 as a wave type, tuned to -12 semitones. So this would also work as a bass in the overall composition of the sound. And again, I'm detuning 6 cents there to increase that phasing and detuning of an analog sound. Let me show you a little bit how each of these 2 waveforms sounds like alone by going back to the mixer again, soloing now first oscillator 1. If you remember oscillator 1 here, this is our 7th semitone interval, and this is the waveform that you just heard. And now back to the mixer, let me solo oscillator 2 here, and let's hear how that wave sounds like. So you hear the role of oscillator 2 in the main composition is to bring in that metallic, almost like guitar metallic string sound to the overall composition. When I started to test out with these 3 different waveforms, actually my first hint was that the metallic sound would come from linear frequency modulation. But every time I tried to do this type of modulation, I wasn't so happy about my final result. I achieved much better results just by making use of the reach waveform library from Hydra, but you can still reproduce this patch by taking the essence of each wave and bearing in mind the tuning interval of the 3 oscillators. Once I was done with my sound sources here, this was when I went more technical in depth with Hydra to work upon my voicing. So let's have a look what I have configured there. I have set this patch to be polyphonic. However, to be honest with you, for Breathe This Air, this is a monophonic sound. I left open for exploration, but if you are reproducing this in your synth, you might as well use polyphony set to monophonic. I'm adding analog feel, which will also bring some of the detuning and phasing of an analog synthesizer. And the same here with random phase on. What this parameter does to your voicing is to mimic the behavior of an analog oscillator that is oscillating even before you gate any notes from your keyboard. So whenever I press the keyboard, I might be in any phases of my oscillator. I've also turned on the warm mode to increase that analog feeling. This is up to you, but on page 2 here you can zero the vibrato amount, and what this will do is to decouple the default connection between the mod wheel in the Hydrasynth and the pitch modulation of your oscillator. But this is up to you, the same way as you can use it in polyphonic mode if you wish. Okay, so just to recapitulate here, I started my sound design from envelope 2 to get that plucky sound of the lead. Then I moved to find sound sources that will give me that saturation and growling of the analog, and then I went to fix my voice to make it even more sound like an analog synthesizer. After doing that, and to create even more the feeling of a saturation, I came to the ring noise here, and I actually added pink noise into the mix. I have as my noise sources oscillator 1 for source 1 and oscillator 2 for source 2. I haven't done any sort of ring modulation there. I've set my noise volume to 48.8. So now if we look again to our mixer here, you will see all my sound sources. Oscillator 1, that high pitch oscillator set to a 7th interval. Oscillator 2, my first bass that carries that metallic sound. And my oscillator 3 has this bass thick sound resembling the square wave. And last but not least, my noise to create that distortion. After resolving my signal chain here with that plucky envelope and the sound sources, the next logical step for me was to actually work on my filters. And I started here in filter 1 by adding a low pass filter, and I have chosen low pass fat 12 for a 12 dB per octave, setting my initial cutoff frequency to 25.8. If you are doing this in another system, the range for the cutoff frequency in Hydra is 0 to 128, and my resonance value was 73.8. But if you look here, I'm actually making use of envelope 1, which is pre-routed here in Hydrasynth to filter 1. And my envelope influence on my cutoff frequency is of 32.5. We will look in a minute into that envelope and what it's doing. No influence from my LFO, and I have my filter following the key track at 100%. But remember, I wanted a thick sound. So to add a spice to my mix, if we actually go to page 2 here, I have driven my filter quite a lot to a value of 78.0, mimicking a little bit the characteristic of, for instance, a Moog synthesizer that gets quite hot into the low pass filter. And in page 2 here, it's also important to observe that my filter routing is in series, which means that first my sound is coming from the mixer into filter 1 and then in series into filter 2. And this is important because in this sound design I'm actually making use of both filters. So let's have a look at filter 2 here, and this is a hybrid filter, low pass notch high pass. And if we look here to the filter shape, you will see that I'm actually using it more as a low pass filter in this configuration before modulation. So this is done by leaving my morph value here to 0. The cutoff frequency for filter 2 is 108.5. My resonance set to 61.4, but the envelope 1, that is this one pre-routed to my filter chain there, has now a negative influence, meaning that I'm inverting the envelope to a value of minus 18.9. No influence from LFOs and velocity, and this filter is not being tracked by the keyboard, so it has a more static value in that sense. So now let's have a look into what envelope 1, my filter envelope, is actually doing here. So if we look at my envelope 1, the envelope shape is quite similar to my amplifier envelope, but here I added other characteristics that will help us to have this almost wah sound when I trigger one note rapidly. And this is achieved by having a very short attack of 9 milliseconds, a longer decay of 240 milliseconds that will make this filter swipe when we have resonance there, a sustain level of 47.6, and a quite long release of 896 milliseconds, almost 1 second there. And if we now go to page 2 here, you will see that I've actually added attack exponential to a value of -32, decay curve exponential to a value of 22, but I haven't changed anything on the release curve there. So in essence, this was it for my signal chain. Before I start processing the signal with effects, 3 oscillators, pink noise, a low pass filter, not so resonant, with a second filter that can be morphed between low pass notch and high pass. And this will be important when we talk about our modulation, because this filter will have a big role while creating our macros and modulation. But once I was happy with the filtered sound, this was when I decided to give the final touch of shaping this sound by compressing it here in my pre-effects chain. Compression has a big role for me here, but this is also something I want to discuss with you between creating a patch from scratch in a specific system for instance playing it live or DAW-less versus creating this sound to be recorded post-produced in a DAW, for instance. I have chosen to apply the compressor from Hydrasynth to allow me to play this patch live without having to plug my computer in. But if you're doing this in another system or you want to have more flexibility to record the sound, you might also bypass this compression and do it in your DAW with your favorite systems. But in essence, what I did here, I'm not using any side chain to kick in my compression. I'm gating it from my keyboard, but you can see that my ratio is quite high, 17:6:1, with a threshold quite low at -36 dB, which will activate this compressor even with a very low signal. Super fast attack of 10 milliseconds, a longer release of 340 milliseconds, and I kicked the output gain to a level of 418 to compensate for how much I was compressing this sound, leaving my dry wet to 100%. So this sound is heavily compressed to create that whoomp effect that you get from Jon Hopkins' lead sounds. But rest assured that as the good producer that Jon Hopkins is, he is automating this compression where he would have much more control in Ableton and he will create all his dynamics there. I've actually seen a recent video of Jon Hopkins playing Breathe This Air live, and he's creating a lot of dynamics by modulating compression and his filters in real time with different MIDI controllers. I think that's where he gets his sound so organic and hard to reproduce, because as he says, he's improvising a lot. So you will have to balance how much of the processing you want to do it to play this DAW-less in case you are doing this in a Hydra versus choosing your favorite tools from the DAW. And this also applies to the rest of the effect chain here, because for this sound I'm actually using Hydra's reverb, but I've created a macro to be able to disable that in case I wanted to record and apply the reverb on my DAW instead. And that's exactly what I did for the intro of this video. But in any case, if you want to apply the same Hydra effect that I did, I have added the cloud reverb here from Hydra with a pre-delay of 46.6 milliseconds, time freeze with a tone of -24.9, a high damp of 24.2, low damp of 112.2, and my dry and wet is set to 0 now because this is being controlled by my Reverb Macro that I will show you in the end. So this is it for the signal chain that creates this sound, but I need to show you all the modulation I'm doing under the hood in Hydrasynth by accessing here my mod matrix. So if we look here on page 1, I'm actually routing my poly aftertouch to my envelope 1 sustain level to a level of 88. And if you remember, my envelope 1 is actually the one controlling my filter cutoff frequencies there. So what this is doing is basically whenever I reach the aftertouch region of my keyboard, you would hear that I'm actually opening the cutoff frequency of my filters. But instead of doing this directly on the cutoff parameter there, what I have chosen to do to create a more subtle effect was to actually affect the sustain level of the envelope. So once the node is triggered and we are in the sustain phase, this is when I'll be affecting the cutoff frequency. So this way, when I have this wah effect created by my envelope 1 modulation, I don't break that chain by simply connecting the aftertouch to the cutoff frequency. I respect the filter envelope cycle. However, you would normally expect, since my filter cutoff is opening, that I have that increase of volume in the sound. But I try to create a live performance element here with this second modulation, routing my poly aftertouch to envelope 2 sustain level, but this time to a negative value of 91.2. So if you remember, envelope 2 is my pre-routed amplifier envelope, and what this will do with the sound there is that if I reach aftertouch and I press it to the end, I will actually kill the sound more or less like this. However, when I release the key, what happens is that I will actually reach my envelope 2 release phase. Therefore, I get an increase of volume again, creating a very interesting rhythmic effect that is characteristic of Jon Hopkins' modulation and automation. So if I go back to the mod matrix here, what this negative influence of poly aftertouch is doing to the envelope is cutting the volume of my amplifier, but again through the envelope sustain phase and not directly to volume. So that when I release aftertouch on my keyboard there, I get that bounce back of the sound with a wah rebounce effect, a reaction, right? And that creates a quite fun dynamic while playing. But that's not all, and this might be a little bit restricted to our Hydra users here, but I have created a few macros that I've used in the intro for this video. And the macros I named as filter, reverb, and cutoff. Hydrasynth don't let you personalize these names, but if you come with me, I will explain what every one of them do. So if we first look to the filter macro here, this one is a quite complex one. In essence, I wanted a macro to have the same effect as opening a low-pass filter cutoff frequency. But when I was doing this directly from the filter, I was not getting the desired effect, which was probably achieved by Jon Hopkins by applying filters to the overall synth track in the DAW. So then what I did was actually to, again, use that trick of affecting the envelope sustain instead of routing directly the value of my macro to the cutoff frequency. So envelope 1 is my filter envelope, and by increasing the value with a depth of 69.2 here for the envelope sustain, I'm actually affecting, while pressing the key, my cutoff frequency of both filters. However, if you remember, envelope 1 is affecting filter 1 and filter 2 in different ways, with a negative impact in filter 2 and a positive impact in filter 1. Therefore, I've actually added here in the second step of my macro that this macro will affect envelope 1 amount in filter 2 to a value of 28.5. So this is increasing the effect of my envelope sustain here for filter 2. And since I wanted to create more harmonics, if you remember filter 1 was not so resonant, I'm actually increasing a tiny bit of the resonance of filter 1 to a value of 7.8. Just so that when I open my filter macro, I'm actually also emphasizing some of the frequencies there a little bit more to boost the volume of the sound. And if I now go to page 2, I do a slight increase in the volume of oscillator 1, which is that high pitch oscillator in my mix, to a value of 26.5. I'm slightly increasing the volume of oscillator 2, which is my metallic sound, to a value of 13.8, and last but not least increasing our third oscillator, oscillator 3 volume, which has the function of a bass with a square wave, to a value of 14.5. If I now go to page 3 here, and this was a nice modulation, I'm actually making use of filter 2 morph parameter. If you remember, filter 2 is the one that is a morph between low pass notch and high pass. this. And what I'm doing here is morphing that filter back into a notch level. And this helped me to create another sound characteristic for this opening of the filter that is not only modulating your normal low pass filter cutoff frequency, because I had these two filters in series. And last but not least, now since I'm actually having a notch to a specific frequency of my overall sound, I'm actually fine-tuning the cutoff frequency of filter 2 to filter a specific part of the spectrum that was not the original cutoff frequency there. A lot of try and error, but I think the main lesson here is that instead of simply modulating your cutoff frequency in your filter directly, making use of the sustain phase of your filter envelope to modulate instead will let your sound much more responsive to how you play and create much more dynamics. Now let me exit filter macro here and let's have a look at the reverb macro. This is a very simple one. Like I mentioned before, I wanted to have flexibility to use an external effect and not be stuck only with Hydra reverberation here. So basically what this macro does is to increase the volume or the dry wet of my reverb to its maximum 128, adding or removing reverb from my signal chain. And last but not least, the cutoff macro here. And the reason why I created this one was to do that high pass filter effect that you hear from the introduction. So the cutoff macro is basically affecting the morph of my filter 2, but this time, instead of morphing the low pass into the notch region, I'm actually going all the way to a high pass filter. This way I will gain an extra performance possibility to also filter this lead sound from its lower frequencies. So here is how all the macro sounds like. First, the opening of the filter. Now the reverb. And last but not least, the cutoff frequency or the high pass filter. Again, this is just to enrich or give you more possibilities while playing this patch DAW-less independently of your computer, but I also try to give you the freedom to remove these effects and post-process your patch in your DAW to maybe get higher quality effects or effects that sounds more like Jon Hopkins or any artist that you are trying to sound design. Last but not least here, a tip. When I save this patch, I actually left the value of my filter macro to about 25 there, because this gave me a timbre that sounds more like Jon Hopkins' original recording. So super quick recap. I've started my sound design process with my envelope, that very short plucky sound envelope for my amplifier. I've then selected 3 different waveforms that sounded more like this square wave aggressive sound of the MS-20, and a big lesson here was to tune this first oscillator here to a value of 7 semitones to bring that characteristic techno sound from Jon Hopkins, and having 2 oscillators, one to create a metallic sound and another one that makes the bass sound, and my lower frequencies assembling more or less a square wave, aggressive square wave there. From there I worked into 2 filters in parallel, also with a plucky envelope that creates a little Y effect for every time I trigger a note. First filter, a low pass 12 dB per octave, and a second filter, a filter that I can actually morph between notch, high pass and low pass, and I'm doing the morphing with my macros. And I have a high ratio compression here to create even more this pumping sound of techno. Reverb at your taste. In modulation here, I have created that performance feature where I can actually connect the aftertouch to mute my sound, but still leaving this resource of having a release sound to help the sound pump for a rhythmic effect. And I've created 3 different macros, one resembling more this low pass filter cutoff modulation, one to add or remove your Hydra reverb from the signal chain, and last but not least a macro that I call here cutoff, which I use to create this high pass filter effect by affecting the morph of my filter to there. Well, this is what I wanted to bring for you today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments if you rather know more about my process or if you prefer the didactic version that I usually present the signal chain for you when we are doing patches in Hydra. And I consider this video the first of many on Jon Hopkins, because just by analyzing what he does in the sound design was a masterclass for me. A lot of cool tricks I've learned just by trying to reproduce his sound. Thank you for all subscribers. Thanks for having me till the end of this video today, and as always, thanks for watching.